Okay, today I'm going to talk about artificial gravity. And I'm just going to tell you right now, there's a lot of science fiction as well as highly conceptual designs when it comes to this topic. But today I'm just going to focus on what actually exists and basically some realizations going into this concept. So, why do we need artificial gravity and why is it necessary for space travel? Like, if you wanted to go to Mars, it would take half a year or maybe even longer, and you want to sustain yourself during that journey. One reason is to sustain biological life. If you ever seen astronauts after coming from space, you might notice they have difficulties with normal Earth activities, such as simply standing and walking. And this is because they haven't had much gravitational strain on their bones and muscles. Similarly, you can imagine a human heart is primarily composed of muscle, and actually being in space or microgravity for long periods of time can actually change the shape of your heart from an oval to a bowl-like shape. This is due to the heart and blood not having to deal with the forces of gravity, so the heart gets weaker when you return to Earth. If you Google different systems and ideas for artificial gravity, you will notice that most just use centripetal force, which manipulates rotational motion to produce an inwards force. Most of these designs, as you can imagine, try to simulate Earth's gravity. And the problem about that is that these designs end up being very large, like around 50 meters, which brings in concerns like of collisions with space debris and also the general stability of the AEG system. Like if you use rotating joints in your design, for example, there's always that possibility of your design just falling apart under its own inertia. Another concern with these AG designs is motion sickness. Like if you ever rode on merry-go-rounds or amusement park rides that spin, you know what it feels like to be dizzy. However, some people think that this effect can go away. Like the human body can adapt to this, which we will talk about later. So hopefully now you have a good idea of what AG is, and now I'm going to talk about how some of those real life applications can be implemented. So NASA did an experiment last year where they essentially sent flies to the space station and observed the effects of artificial gravity on them. Half of them were in a centrifuge-like device and half of them were not. And after 3-ish days, they sent them back to Earth and observed the results. So the device they used for this experiment is called a multi-use variable platform, which is essentially a centrifuge that can tilt as well. It consists of a spinning disk and it changes rotation speed and tilt depending on the desired level of gravity you want. So, anyways, in this experiment, the AG flies were put on that disk and they used different age groups, of course, to avoid that discrepancy. Um, and they wanted to compare that against something, so they made another group of flies outside of the centrifuge. And those guys just experienced microgravity from the Earth, same as any astronaut inside the space station. Okay, after 30 days, they observed them back on Earth, and that's where NASA scientists observed them. Some of these tests they did, they just tested if the flies could climb walls or and if the flies still fly. The result was the artificial gravity flies were less active than the microgravity flies, as in the flies that weren't in that centrifuge, but they were able to climb the walls faster. They did some neurological tests and determined that the AG flies had less neurological damage than the flies that were not in the centrifuge, but since both flies had some sort of damage due to space travel, they concluded that the artificial gravity at least partially protected them. This isn't necessarily the case for humans, which have a very different biological makeup, of course. So, on another note, there's something interesting I found online. If you're one of those people who are lazy and don't really want to work, this one's for you guys. And yes, it's just as the title says, NASA is giving out handouts for people to literally just lay in bed and do nothing. That's kind of why I wanted to mention this experiment. Basically, if you're willing to stay in bed for 2-ish months, you could get paid for 19K US. This is an interesting experiment since they are basically testing the effects of artificial gravity for humans instead of flies. So basically, their goal of this experiment is to find benefits of artificial gravity by seeing if they can simulate negative effects of space weightlessness. And they do this by tilting beds about 6 degrees downwards towards your head. They put half of those tilted beds in the centrifuge and half in a regular room. And the idea is that the centrifuge will force the blood away from your head and back into your extremities. Some rules, though, for participants is that they have to stay in the bed for 60 days and they aren't allowed to either sit, stand, or even walk. So just consider that before signing up for this experiment. So at the moment, there isn't any universal or practical implementation of artificial gravity in space. And like said previously, we are currently testing for those health benefits of artificial gravity, even though in theory we know that they should work. And hopefully, yeah, like this does get implemented and it'll be able to support long distance space travel. And actually, I think Japan wants to do artificial gravity on the moon to supposedly make some sort of biome there. But it's only in its research stage. And I guess the idea of using artificial gravity on low mass planets is to just simulate an Earth-like environment. And yeah, here are my sources. I just use like NASA research paper that the NASA scientists used and news article on that bed experiment. And yeah, that concludes my presentation on artificial gravity. So there's many things out there already, and I just basically summarized the things that NASA is trying to do. And yeah, I'm glad you sat through the end, and thank you for listening.